In this video, I'm going to do a little deep dive into acceptance and commitment therapy, a look at what I perceive to be the strengths and the weakness of that particular psychological framework. Now, my introduction to acceptance and commitment therapy was interesting. I was doing a presentation back in 2015 at something called the Change Phenomena, which used to be a annual hypnosis conference in the UK. I spoke at the first Change Phenomena conference back in 2010, and I also spoke at the last one in 2015. And after my presentation, this psychologist came up to me and gave me some complimentary remarks about my presentation and live client work demo on stage. And he said that it's really cool to see, someone in the hypnosis world really embody and practice and use acceptance and commitment therapy skillfully. And I was kind of taken back by that because while I had heard the term ACT or acceptance and commitment therapy, I had never read a book about it or been to a course. I virtually knew nothing about it. And when I told a psychologist that, he kind of refused to believe it. He essentially considered me to be an ACT guy, right? And then a few years later, I was in a bookstore in Copenhagen, and I always look by the psychology, books, and I saw The Liberated Mind by Stephen C. Hayes, and I bought it and I read it, and it immediately dawned on me how a lot of the stuff I did was quite similar to ACT at the time because I realized that Stephen C. Hayes was a student of Albert Ellis. That was one thing. And I've also been deeply influenced by the work of Albert Ellis and rational emotive behavior therapy. I also could see that he had had an awakening experience during a panic attack. This is Stephen C. Hayes I'm talking about, the founder of ACT. He had had an awakening experience of sorts where he, instead of being fused with his thoughts, suddenly had the realization that he was that which observed the thoughts, consciousness or awareness itself. And he had this during a panic attack. And I've had such awakening experiences and insights myself. We've clearly both looked into meditation and mindfulness, many of the same influences. So, not that strange that a lot of the stuff I was doing on stage seemed to match with acceptance and commitment therapy, even though I had never formally studied it. But since then, I've read quite a few of ACT books, and I've spent the last 28 years seeing clients. So, as I said in this video, I'm going to look into what I perceive to be the strengths and weaknesses of acceptance and commitment therapy as I understand it. So, acceptance and commitment therapy is a psychological framework, a form of psychotherapy that essentially attempts to address people's psychological rigidity and to foster more psychological flexibility to help them lead more meaningful and fulfilling lives. And it's part of the so-called third waves of cognitive therapy. So the first wave was the old behaviorists like B.F. Skinner, who spent their time doing experiments on how to modify behavior and to build new habits. The second school, the second wave, was CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, as originated by Orrin Beck, and rational emotive behavior therapy, as originated by Albert Ellis. Now, both of these guys had a lot of focus on behavioral interventions, but they also more emphasized cognition, how we interpret and make meaning, and how we are not really just responding to events, but our interpretations and our meaning making. So these guys would spend a lot of time helping people to spot errors in their thinking, irrational thinking patterns, and to dispute and challenge these thinking patterns to come up with more rational ways of thinking. The third generation which consists of methods such as ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, and metacognitive therapy, and dialectical behavior therapy, and a few others. These concern themselves less with disputing the content of what you think, but more with changing your relationship to thoughts and feelings. And that really is a huge improvement. There's clearly a lot of influence here by the meditative traditions of the East and mindfulness practices. So in ACT, there's basically six principles, and I'm going to go through them. One of them is diffusion. And diffusion essentially concerns itself with the fact that we tend to get lost in our thoughts and to kind of be fused with them. And when we're fused with our thoughts and don't really see that they are thoughts, they look like reality. And we tend to have strong emotional responses to them. And we tend to act upon these thoughts rather uncritically. So diffusion are these methods not to kind of dispute and challenge the content of the thinking so much, but more to help someone to realize that, hey, wait a minute, these are actually thoughts. These are actually events in the mind, so to speak. Here's something really interesting to notice, by the way. These various diffusion techniques, whether they are hearing the internal dialogue in Donald Duck's voice or with a sleepy voice, or kind of dissociating and watching the images as an object, or rewinding the movie backwards, or writing down the thoughts on a card and carrying it around, or these exercises where you kind of deliberately violate your own thinking by saying that it's impossible to, for example, stand up while you do it. These sorts of techniques. Um, if you look at neurolinguistic programming, the old classic code of the 70s and the 80s, you will see that what Stephen Hayes called diffusion methods in ACT has a very strong resemblance with these typical NLP patterns, which is kind of interesting because acceptance and commitment therapy is one of the methods that has the strongest kind of scientific backing for its effectiveness. A lot of the same people who talk well about ACTS will diss NLP and claim that it is a pseudoscience. But for those who say that, I would say, what is the big difference between the NLP patterns and the diffusion techniques of ACTS? I really fail to see any difference. Um, so if you look at these techniques, as I said, this were stuff that John Grinder and Richard Bandler did back in the 70s. And several of these were also typical techniques that Milton Erickson used to practice back in the day. One typical example would be this technique of deliberately violating your own thoughts, for example. That's often used in ACT. It's interesting how I don't know if Stephen Hayes has studied Milton Erickson or studied neurolinguistic programming at all. He never seems to mention it. Of course, that doesn't mean that he necessarily have studied it. He could have independently come up with it or gotten them from another source, but I think it is kind of an interesting observation. Another aspect of ACT is what is called self as context. So, and this, in my opinion, is a huge improvement and advancement over CBT and REBT. As I said, Stephen Hayes had this awakening experience during a panic attack, where instead of completely being identified with and fused with his thinking, he suddenly had this experience of being identified with consciousness or awareness or observing itself, right? And if you look at the writings of people like Eckhart Tolle and other spiritual teachers, You will see that so much of it revolves around helping people to make a distinction between being and thinking. So I'm really glad that ACT emphasizes this, self as context. This, instead of being fused with and identified with thinking and feeling, there's instead an identification with witnessing or observing or consciousness itself. And that makes thoughts and feelings look way less personal and way less threatening and way less scary. You have more space around it. You'll take it less seriously. And that also really helps in terms of another principle in ACT, which is acceptance. And I think this is also something that ACT does better than the second generation schools of CBT and REBT, and also neuro linguistic programming mostly, is an emphasis on acceptance, of becoming genuinely curious and open to your own inner experience, and to be able to be with it with less resistance, more lightheartedness, more presence, more curiosity, building these sorts of capacity. Again, this is more about how you relate to your experience. And this is important because it's not the thoughts and feelings themselves which is the issue. It's your relationship to them. It's your level of resistance. As the meditation teacher Shinsen Young very often has said, he said, our psychological suffering is thoughts and feelings multiplied by resistance, right? So the tendency, and this is something that I did in my career too, way before I discovered ACT, is to help people to cultivate more willingness to have the thoughts and feelings that they have. The more you can cultivate that, the more you decrease the resistance. So I really like the way they do this in ACT, and I also like the way they do exposure work, because exposure work in the old first wave and second wave, kind of presupposed that it's the situation. You're becoming more comfortable with the situation and managing the situation better. But ACT is quite clear that what you're really exposing is your own thoughts and feelings. You're decreasing the resistance. You're building your willingness and ability to stay present and curious with regards to your own experience. So the way they do exposure work, by framing it as it's an internal thing, it's about building the willingness to be present with your own experience, is also a big improvement in my mind over the more traditional approaches. In addition to that, we have contact with the present moment, that ability to be present where you are instead of being lost in rumination and lost in worry. Here they draw heavily upon the wisdom traditions of the East and various mindfulness practices, which is good. Another one is helping people clarify their values. Values essentially being the qualities that you believe to be important, and to do your best to live a life which is in alignment or an expression of these values. People who are happier and who live more fulfilled lives tend to emphasize doing their best to live a values-based life, to live a meaningful life. And finally, an emphasis on committed action. So a lot of strengths here. As I said, I'm mostly a fan. I'm mostly an advocate of this form of working. Couple of weaknesses, I think, that are worth pointing out. And one of them is there's a distinction between becoming better at kind of noticing thoughts or seeing thoughts as thoughts versus helping someone to discover the fact of thinking itself, meaning thought as a principle. The very notion that everything you experience is made of thought. So let me offer you a little analogy. What is it that makes a nightmare scary? Let's say that you fall asleep one night and you have a dream, and in this dream, you're being kidnapped by a group of cannibals. You're being tied to a totem pole, and soon they're going to chop you into pieces, put you into a stew, and you're going to be eaten as sacrifice for the chief, right? Now, let's say that you were dreaming that. The only reason why it's scary is because at the moment of thinking it, you're completely unaware that the whole experience is made of thought. The chief, what you call the chief, is made of thought. The totem pole is made of thought. The character I, or me, that everything seems to be revolving around, is itself made of thought and a thought construct. So when we completely lose track of that, it looks as if what we think is reality and is happening, and that we are the character that everything revolves around. Now, as the character, you could be mindful of your thoughts and see thoughts as thoughts. But what you're not seeing is that the entire experience is made of thought to begin with. So consider what happens the moment you wake up from the nightmare, the moment you open your eyes, stare into the ceiling, and realize that the whole thing was a nightmare. The fear vanishes. Why? Because you realize that the whole thing was made of thought, right? So, and this is what I try to teach in what I call the psychological illusion model. Uh, Other people who teach this too are students of Sydney Banks who teach something called the three principles. And that is waking up to the fact that you think, that your experience is made of thought to begin with. Another subtle analogy here, let's say that you're watching a movie in the cinema, and the train is moving towards you at full speed. Back in 1895, when the first ever movie was shown, allegedly quite a few people leaped from their seats in panic to avoid being run over by the train. The reason why you and I don't do that, meaning the reason why you and I don't leap from our seats when there's a seemingly a train on the movie screen coming towards us, is not because we see every thought as a thought, that we're mindful of events in the mind moment by moment, but it's because we have a deeper understanding of film. We know that the whole experience is made of thoughts. And that makes it so that we can get absorbed into any movie and enjoy it and feel the feelings without ever really feeling threatened. So I think this is a distinction that's lacking in ACT, thought as principle. Another kind of drawback is, you don't really have to do anything with your thoughts. I mean, if we go back to that movie scenario, sitting in the cinema watching the movie, if there's a burglary scene in the movie, you never call the cops. If someone gets attacked and hurt, you never chase the bad guy or do CPR on the victim, right? There's nothing to solve whatsoever because you understand the nature of film. Once you understand thought or the role of thoughts, the idea that you would need to do any techniques to modify or change your thoughts really becomes mute in a sense, right? In metacognitive therapy, they practice something called detached mindfulness, which is essentially just watching your thoughts. In the three principles, there's no techniques at all, right? So I think the diffusion techniques of acceptance and commitment therapy can be a double-edged sword in a sense. On the one hand, they might be extremely useful if you use them as tools to help people kind of discover the illusory nature of thoughts. To the extent that you do that in an artistic way, they can be quite useful. But of course, the diffusion techniques can also help people fall into a trap where we kind of end up buying into the thoughts more, or the diffusion techniques themselves are of course just other thoughts, right? So they can kind of make it seem as if the thoughts are important and that we need these techniques and methods to kind of handle our inner experience. This is, of course, my main objection to the way neurolinguistic programming is taught is that so many people end up thinking that the power lies in the techniques. All thoughts are neutral. No thought has any inherent power to make you do, feel, or think anything. It's all what we attribute to the thoughts, right? So if you get that, you'll also get that no technique has any inherent power. So if you look at the field of neurolinguistic programming or CBT or various schools of hypnotherapy or most forms of psychotherapy, people are essentially sold this idea that techniques and formats and rituals have power and that certain techniques can work on certain so-called conditions. Now these conditions too are just a collection of thoughts not seen as thoughts, right? So there's a little trap to fall into there as well. And finally, you know, as they emphasize in metacognitive therapy, it's not really the thoughts that lead to what we call depression and anxiety, but it's the processes of rumination and worry. I don't see these processes dealt with directly, as in exploring people's beliefs about these processes and what use people might think that they serve. Now, notice this too. Virtually all of our so-called problematic thinking revolves around a hallucinated future or a kind of reconstructed past. But you never experience a past and you never experience a future. It's impossible to experience a future event or a past event. So what you can do is you can help people to experientially discover that they never experience a past and they never experience a future or a past event or a future event. I don't really see this emphasized in acceptance and commitment therapy. And finally, as a final critique, as Thomas Sauce pointed out for in 60 years of writing, there really is no psychotherapy because there's nothing to treat. What's called mental illness, in psychiatry and psychology, these are not actually illnesses. These are only diagnoses in a metaphorical sense. As Thomas Sauce used to say, you know, a mental illness stands in relation to an actual illness, like a brain disease, like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or epilepsy. In the same way that if you go into a bar and you order a screwdriver, you don't get a working tool. You get a drink with vodka and orange juice and some other stuff. It's a metaphor. The metaphorical drink screwdriver stands in relation to the actual working tool, the way that a mental illness diagnosis stands in relation to an actual brain disease. A brain can be sick because it's an organ. A mind, per definition, cannot be sick because it has no objective qualities. You can't even localize it. So the whole idea of mental illness and therapy is really a misnomer, and it's only therapy and treatment and illness in a metaphorical sense. And I think the people in the ACT industry could do a way better job of acknowledging that mental illness really is a myth, and that the diagnosis and treatment is strictly a metaphor. I hope this was useful. I'd love to hear what you think, whether you agree, disagree, whatever comments you might have. Know that I see clients from all over the world online, so if you would like to make some sort of change and you're curious to see if you and I could be a good fit, I invite you to send me an email through provocativehypnosis.com. If you're watching this in 2025, know that I have a seminar coming up, which is about meditation and mindfulness in therapy, coaching, and change work. So if you'd like to explore that, you can go to provocativehypnosis.com and hit the seminar page, and you'll get all the information there. As always, thanks for listening.